All right, so in our first session, we talked about general ideas about what it means to have an ethical worldview, the assumptions that we make about reality, sources of knowledge. How do we know what is good and what is bad? How do we know what we should value, and how do we know how to put those principles into action? Right? The biggest challenge that comes up for any worldview is establishing a moral authority that can unify these components and resolve the conflicts between them. Now, in this second part, or after this introduction, we want to talk about the Islamic worldview. The framework that we're using today is largely taken from the work of Dr. Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, rahimahullah, who wrote a book called Tawheed and its implications in life. I think it was, for the time that it was written in, it was an extremely important book, and one that I think should be read by everyone. If you don't know who Dr. Faruqi was, he was a professor of Islam, and he passed away, I believe, or he was assassinated, actually, in the early 1980s. And he was a proponent of not just talking about Islamic belief as a belief, but it translating into something meaningful in our lives, which is why he wrote the book that he did. So the central argument, as he presents it, and he says what Islam's central argument is about its own worldview, is that Islam offers a perfectly coherent and comprehensive system of life, because every single aspect of it flows from one and only one fundamental component, which is the principle of Tawheed, the principle of God's oneness. So what is Tawheed? So obviously, or we translate it many times as monotheism, but this word seems to be insufficient. It's a radical, absolute, and uncompromising oneness of God. So as Al-Faruqi, he says, it is the conviction and witnessing that there is no one worthy of worship but God. That there is no God, lowercase g, but God, capital G. So it's not just a theological statement, but it's a first principle of reality. It's a master key that unlocks everything else. So his argument is that you truly grasp the implications, that if you truly grasp the implications of Tawheed, you will understand the Islamic view of metaphysics, of morality, of history, of knowledge, of social order, of family, of politics, of economics, and most importantly, as we're talking today, about ethics. So we want to follow the chain of logic that he sets up. And so we'll be using the chain of logic that he creates in that book and bolstering it with many of the Islamic texts that come in more traditional books on the topic, like Ma'arij al-Qabul by Hafiz al-Hakami, one of the scholars of the area of South Arabia, Yemen, that area, who wrote a book on Tawheed as well, but from a more traditional perspective. So the establishment of Tawheed as the first and most fundamental truth is where we start in Islamic texts. Right? So where does the worldview of Islam begin? Well, it begins with the most fundamental question of all, and that is, why are we here? So if we're able to answer this question, we understand better what is our purpose. So the first and foremost obligation and the foundational purpose of our existence is the singular worship of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me. So our primary purpose, or the primary purpose of human existence, is the singular worship of God. So this sets the stage for a life that is fundamentally theocentric. So we're all centered on our object of worship, which is God himself. But this isn't an arbitrary command that we're given here in the Quran. The Quran frames the idea of worshiping God as a logical consequence of knowing that there is a just and a wise creator. So this idea of worship God alone, because that's your purpose in life, is tempered by another question, a rhetorical question. أم حسبتم أنما خلقناكم عبثا وأنكم إلينا لا ترجعون? Do you think that we created you in jest and that you would not return to us? The Quran asks, or Allah asks us in the Quran. So the logic here is that a purposeless creation would be futile, would be worthless. There would be no reason to create creation without a purpose. So the absurdity would contradict the very nature of a perfect and wise God. So the fact that we exist, the fact that creation is here, and the fact that we can recognize that there is a God means that that God is perfect and wise, and that he created us for a purpose. Somebody could say, well, how do we know that there's not more than one God? Right? The Quran actually answers this question itself. لو كان فيهما آلهة لو كان فيه آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if there were gods other than God, if there are gods other than Allah in existence, then the world would become corrupt. Meaning that the fabric of space and time would not be able to exist if you had all-powerful beings, all of them vying for control of the same created space. Therefore, there's only one logical conclusion, and that is that there is one separate all-powerful being, and there is the creation that he created. And since he created that creation, he either acts out of wisdom or he doesn't. And to be created without purpose would not be indicative of ultimate wisdom or justice. And therefore, if we believe in a wise and a just God, then we believe that there's a purpose in life as well. So our purpose as man is not simply just to worship in a ritualistic sense, but it is to take the idea of worship and devotion as a principle and apply it to all things in life. So we're not just to sit around and passively contemplate over how we live, but instead we're to be active and world engaging. We're to be part of society that we live in, and we're to try and do the best that we can in the situations that we are. We have a mission to fulfill and to realize the moral dimension of God's divine will. So when the Quran says that we were created to worship, it means we were created for a purpose. And that purpose is to actively align our lives and our societies and our world with the will of our Creator. But how is this obligation introduced to humanity? How do we know what this will is? Right? So Islamic texts answer this by presenting a covenant, the idea of a covenant. There's a threefold series of covenants between God and man. So the vocation of man is a cosmic vocation. Worship is something that goes beyond just being a ritual, standing in the mosque all day and praying and fasting. But it goes beyond that to actually taking the effects of your prayers. Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. Prayer should prohibit you from evil and lewdness. So your worship should have an effect on your life. It should affect your core moral being. So your worship is not just an action, a ritual action, but it's a cosmic vocation, which means that your very purpose of existence, your sole reason for existing, is that you have this mission to worship God on earth and to act out his divine will. Faruqi, he calls this actionalism, and he uses a mouthful of a phrase when he said is the efficacious actualization of the absolute in history, which just simply means effectively turning your beliefs into good for society. That's all it really means. So he mentions something very important about how we see the world. True faith and true worship are demonstrated through concrete deeds that transform the world for the better. So the world that we live in, is not an evil to be shunned. So there are differing perspectives. We talk about worldview. There are some faiths and perspectives that look at the world as something evil, as something bad. And everything that you experience in the world is evil and bad and a form of suffering. And therefore, detaching yourself from the world is the goal. Islam doesn't say that. Islam says you've been given the world as a trust to use for the benefit of others and to minimize the harm that you do to yourself and to others. So instead of us looking at the world as something that has to be shunned, we should look at the world as a canvas. We are going to paint the picture on that canvas. He says, unlike some faiths, Islam does not regard the world as alien to righteousness or religious felicity. The world is not to be denied or combated. On the contrary, the world is innocent and good. But this has this idea that we look at life as something which is pure. It's pristine. It's innocent. It has huge implications. How you see the world. If you see the world as inherently evil, how will you always approach everything in life? With skepticism, with negativity. If you see the world as something which is inherently good, how will you approach life? With positivity, with hope, with empathy. So in Islam, there's no separation between this idea of the religious and the secular. Politics, economics, family life, social justice, every human endeavor becomes an area for worship based upon your core beliefs, values, and how you imbue those values into what you're doing. Every time, everything you do is oriented towards your divine purpose, it also becomes an act of worship. Does that mean there are no formal acts of worship in Islam? No, there are formal acts of worship in Islam, obviously. There's 5 daily prayers, there's the fasting of Ramadan, there's making pilgrimage to Mecca once in a lifetime, there's giving zakah, right? These are formal acts of worship. But through our intentions and imbuing what our actions are, or the actions that we do, imbuing those actions that we do with our intention, with a good intention, to fulfill the divine, what Allah wants from us, they also become acts of worship. So how does man come to know what his obligation is? So the question for the Muslim is not how do I save myself from the evil world that I live in? But instead, it's how do I transform myself and the world that I live in to be something which is beneficial, because God wants good for us. How does a human being from birth know what this obligation is? So there's this idea of 3 covenants. Okay? These covenants speak to this idea of a cosmic vocation, right? So if God created Adam and he placed Adam on earth and he told the angels, inni ja'iluka inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I'm placing in the earth a khalifa, a steward, a trustee, a vicegerent. Some of us, many times, we think of that role as like a political role. We have to rule with authority. It's much less about that than it is about being a trustee with the blessings that God has given you. So, how do we know that this obligation even exists, or this idea even exists? Well, in Islamic text, there's 3 covenants. So one is a primordial covenant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that when he created Adam, he took the souls of all of his progeny from the back of Adam, and he placed them out on the primordial plane. وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَى شَهِدْنَا. He made them attest to the fact that he was their Lord. He said, "Am I not your Lord?" They said, "Yes, we attest to that fact." So there was an inherent sense of purposefulness placed into the creation of man at its earliest moment, on the primordial state of them just being souls. And what this tells us about is the fundamental ontological reality that Islam bases its belief off of. What do I mean by ontological reality? How we know what the nature of things are. So what is the nature of God? What is the nature of man? The nature of God is that he is creator, separate from his creation. The nature of man is that he is created and subservient to his creator. They are not one and the same, they are completely separate. And when we're able to understand that, and we understand that this is a distinction that is, embedded in the fabric of our souls, from the very moment that before we were even born, that we understand that everything in our life that is predicated on belief in God is going to be predicated on the idea that we are not God and God is not us. Fast forward, I'll give you guys a fast forward. Why is interest forbidden in Islam? Why is interest forbidden? What's the wisdom behind forbidding taking me saying, Yusuf, I'm going to give you $1, you give me $2 back tomorrow? What's your inherent reaction when I say that? Allah forbids it. What's your inherent emotional reaction? It's not fair. It's unjust. It's unjust. Why is it unjust? It creates inequality, right? What if I said, okay, look, I'm going to loan you $1, and then for every day that you can't pay me back that $1, you need to add another $1 to it every day. So today you owe me $1, and if you pay me back tomorrow, you pay me $2. Okay? But if you pay me back 2 days from now, you owe me $3. And let's just say that you can never pay me back. Be in debt forever. Essentially, the law or the idea of charging interest on value breaks the laws of entropy. Okay? It breaks the ability. You will never be able to have enough money in creation to be able to meet the interest rate that is charged, and interest upon interest and upon interest, as that debt grows. So that debt grows beyond what is even comprehensible in life. What happens when you are ingrained in debt, or you're buried in debt and owe somebody money? You go bankrupt. You become indebted to them, subservient to them. You're trying to please them. You're working for them. You're giving them. They're not giving you. Right? So interest inherently puts the position of the creditor in the position of Lord, and the position of debtor in the position of servant. It fundamentally changes the quality of man from equality to, right, hierarchy. Whereas Islam says no, only God has the ability to lord over man. Which is why if you look at the promises that are made by Allah in the Quran to the believers, مَن يُقْرِضُ اللَّهَ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا فَيُضَاعِفَ لَهُ أَضْعَافًا كَثِيرًا. Who will give God a goodly loan so that he can pay him back manyfold? Because God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. Only he can recompense something because he's able to create more than is in existence. But if I'm charging you interest to the point where you're not even able to pay it because there's not enough money even in existence, all right, and I've fundamentally broken the rules or tried to break the rules of how the world that we live in works. So the primordial covenant is this idea that I am not God, God is not me, creator is not creation. There's a complete difference between the two. This persists even when we are born. The Prophet ﷺ said, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Every newborn is born with the innate disposition to know his creator. Allah says, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. This is the natural disposition that God has created mankind in. So the concept here is that every human being is born with the innate natural inclination to recognize a single transcendent creator. And this is also for us very important, because as Muslims, we reject the idea of original sin or someone being born in sin or somebody being culpable for things that they had no part of. So man begins his life ethically, sane and sound, not weighed down by any original sin, however mild or Augustinian. So we're not born broken. The idea as Muslims is we're not born broken. No human being is inherently bad, is inherently broken, is inherently evil, is inherently fallen. We're born innocent. We're given a moral compass that's already oriented towards the truth. But if this knowledge is innate, if it's there in our hearts, why do we need anything else? Because our hearts become clouded by our environment, by our cultures and societies, by our personal choices and our experiences. And this brings the third covenant, which is the covenant of the messengers. So there is revelation that is sent to remind mankind, to guide humanity back to the primordial state that they were created in, and to create a sense of accountability for their own actions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so that mankind will have no argument against Allah after the messengers were sent. So no one can come and claim, well, I didn't know. I never heard the message. The obligation is made clear both internally through the fitrah and externally through revelation. So now we have innate recognition. We have a natural disposition in our hearts to understand that there is good and bad, there is creator and created, and we have a formal revealed message. So these create the moral framework that's both deeply personal and universally accessible. Okay, so if we have these covenants, and we believe that there's an innate sense of understanding that one is created and not creator, and that there's an innate sense that they should be doing something that seeks to serve their creator and do what is good, well, how does someone recognize their creator? Okay, so this is like the cornerstone of the whole discussion. And I want you to humor me for a moment. We're going to talk about 3 proofs for why God exists. Why you should recognize him as your creator. This is the rational proof, the teleological proof, and the axiological proof. Or argument from first cause, argument from design, or the argument from morality. So the core idea here is that belief in God is not blind faith. It's not, jump and then see where your feet will land. But it's considered to be the most rational and logical conclusion that you can come to based upon the overwhelming evidence that you experience in life or that you get from revelation. So this brings us back to that second point. Remember, we said that there's this tension between rationale and revelation, this tension between lived experience and transcendent beliefs, right? Islam says, no, these two are complementary to each other. So the concept of iman, of faith in Islam, is conviction that must be understood and accepted by the mind, right? Faith is not a stumbling block for reason. In Islam, you're not asked to suspend your intellect. You're commanded to use it. It's a very important point. So, to build a case for why we should accept God as our creator, there are 3 pillars or 3 proofs that he uses. Number 1 is the rational proof. Okay? Talk about the origin of existence ourself. And this confronts for us a fundamental question. And that is, could we or anything, for that matter, truly come from absolutely nothing? That's the first question. Could we or anything come from absolutely nothing? The second is the argument from design. So when we open our eyes and we look around us and we observe the universe that we live in, we see a staggering amount of order and purpose and precision in the microcosm and the macrocosm that we live in. And so we have to ask ourselves another question. Does the intricate order that we see not imply that there was someone who put it in order? And then third is the axiological proof, or the argument from morality. So when we turn the investigation inward, and we start to think about our own innate human senses and our experiences, and the idea that we recognize that there is right and wrong, we ask ourselves, well, why do we have a conscience? Where does the feeling of what we should do, I should be nice to this person, where does that feeling come from? Answers the question of, well, where does that feeling come from? So these 3 proofs argue that the evidence for God isn't hidden in some obscure text, but it's found in the laws of logic, the fabric of the cosmos, as well as within our own very souls. So let's dive into it. So the first is a rational proof, or the argument from first cause. So our belief in Allah is not a leap into the dark, we said, but it's the most logical conclusion that we can reach. So our faith has to be understood and accepted by the mind. Now the Quran places this challenge and says, are you yourselves the creators of the heavens and the earth, or were you created? أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ? Were they created by nothing, Or are they the creators? أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, or did they create the heavens and the earth? بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ, they can't be certain. So this creates for us a couple of conclusions that are inevitable. Either you were created from absolute nothingness, there was no power that created you, you just popped up, or you created yourself. How do we know that you cannot be created from nothingness? There has to be a power that created you. Because all actions have to spring from some force behind it. Why can you not be the creator of yourself? It would be an infinite regress. We would not be able to, you created yourself, but then who created you? And you get into this issue of infinite regress. Therefore, our mere existence demands that there was an external, uncreated first cause, which we believe as Muslims is the creator of the heavens and the earth is Allah. Right? So it's like me saying, where did you come from? You go, well, I'm from whatever state. Let's say Mississippi. Well, where are your parents from? My parents are from North Carolina. Where are their parents from? Their parents are from France. Where are their parents from? And you keep going back throughout history. Okay, we get back to the first man and woman. Where did they come from? Even if you wanted to say evolution or something like that, okay, well, where did that come from? Where did that come from? And you keep going back through every instance of creation or existence. There has to be a moment in absolute time where everything didn't exist and then it existed. Who brought that into existence? Well, it couldn't have been me because I exist now, but I didn't exist before. So the only thing that could bring something into existence is something that existed before and exists now. They frame in Arabic as wajib al-wujud. His existence is necessary, whereas my existence is mumkin al-wujud, is possible. It possibly exists, possibly not. Could die now, right? Could die tomorrow. Inshallah I won't. But I didn't exist before, I exist now, I might not exist in the future. The only one that could bring creation into existence is one who existed before, exists now, and will exist in the future, is absolute in his existence. So there has to be a first cause that brought creation into existence. So the first two options are logically impossible. That means the only rational conclusion is the third, that we were created by an external, self-subsistent, uncreated being. The second argument, or the second proof, moves from the logic of our existence to the evidence that we see in the universe around us. So it's an argument from design. So there's two key components here: order and purpose. So first off, we have to look that there is an orderly universe. So the entire scientific method is built upon the assumption that the universe is governed by consistent, predictable laws of nature. That these are consistent, predictable, and universal. So a single, transcendent, and consistent God would be the only one to bring about a universe with immutable laws. Ones where there's the consistency that we see in creation is there. A predictable order of the universe that we live in points to a singular entity who put it in order. But that's not all. Not only is the universe orderly, but it's purposeful. It's a system, but that system was designed with a goal. So, what is that goal? To essentially become a living theater set in motion by God's commands and to serve as a stage for our ethical striving. So the world is perfectly designed to be lived in, to be used, and to have us face moral choices on how to use it. Are we going to fulfill our purpose as moral entities and moral agents, as trustees of what we've been given, or are we going to fail? In the Quran, there are several verses that point to this fact. سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. We will show them our signs in the heavens and in themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. So the fact that we find you see on the slide here, the shell that's pictured, the fact that we find the Fibonacci numbers reflected in the spirals of the shell, and we find the Fibonacci numbers reflected in the spiral of a fern, and we find the Fibonacci numbers reflected in the spirals of snow drafts, and we find the Fibonacci numbers reflected in crystallization. Well, that one instance of consistency through many different instances of creation shows that there has to be something behind that, because it could not have all been random. So just as God reveals text as revelation, then the universe is a book of the signs that reveal its author. Now, this is a question that was asked actually by a famous poet. He said, البعرة تدل على البعير والأثر يدل على المسير فسماء ذات أبراج وبحر ذات أمواج ألا يدل على عليم خبير. He said, a piece of dung means an animal was there, and a path means people walk down it. So if I have a sky full of stars and an ocean full of waves, does it not mean, or does it not show that there is one who is all knowledgeable and well informed? So this is the argument from design, that we have way too many instances of consistent, orderly design for there not to be a purpose behind it. The last argument is the axiological proof, or the idea from morality. Remember the discussion we had earlier about killing? We said that somebody's in Houston, Texas, in Juneau, Alaska, in Papua New Guinea, in Johannesburg, in Calcutta, in Tuvalu, wherever they are in the world, there will be an innate sense that there are certain things that should not be done. We may all disagree whether or not, if someone comes to our home at dinner time, should we feed them at our table? Would you all disagree? Should we feed our guests? Everyone here is going to say yes. There are some cultures where they say no, they don't feed their guests. Oh, you came at dinner time, we weren't expecting you, we didn't make enough. You can sit here and wait. So that's a morally relative issue, right? But would all of those people agree that killing is objectively bad? Yes, they would. So the innate moral sense that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong is a proof that there's something or someone who put those feelings there. So the argument here is that the innate moral sense is an internal proof of an objective, transcendent, and normative reality. So to perceive God as core of normativeness is not possible unless there are beings for whom this normativeness is normative. What does that mean? Mouthful. In other words, you can't agree that murder is bad unless your mind was designed to align with a standard of goodness that's beyond yourself. If everything was relative and up to me, then I could say that murder is good and you could say murder is bad. But again, consistency throughout history, throughout the state of mankind, have always shown that there are certain things that are considered wrong. So the idea that we feel that we ought to do something, that we should do something, implies that there's a source for that feeling. So that makes our conscience an internal compass that points us towards God as the ultimate source of all value. And this connects back to the idea of the fitrah that we talked about earlier, that innate endowment that we have towards our Creator, that all humans possess. So when we look at all of these three things together, the rational proof establishes the logical necessity of a creator. The teleological proof shows the evidence of his intelligence and purpose in the universe. And the axiological proof finds evidence of his reality within our own souls. So, out of these three arguments, which of them speaks most powerfully to you? Which is most impressive to you to say, yeah, this shows me that there is a creator, there is a God? First one. Number two. If society, number three. You say for today's society, number three? I like that. Number three as well? So notice how each of us are going to be attracted to different arguments, right? But would we deny the truth of the other arguments that are there? No. Well, we say, well, this is more convincing to me, or this, number one or number two or number three are more convincing to me. And these are just three. There may be like 7 or 8 more different proofs that are in this rational sense used for the idea that there is a creator, there's an existence beyond ourselves, right? But yeah, guys, aren't we Muslims, right? Like, what's the proof for all of this? Like, because this inevitably, when you talk about things that are rational and logical, people say, but I'm a Muslim, I need to know, from the texts. The beauty is that these arguments are embedded in the texts themselves. So the rational proof we mentioned in the 52nd surah of the Quran, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ, Surah At-Tur. So the Quran presents these logical questions in Surah At-Tur. Were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? So this is a direct intellectual challenge. It corners the mind of the one who's being faced. And it shows that there's a logical absurdity in affirming anything other than an external, uncreated creator. So this is the, argument from first cause in its purest form. The second argument in the middle, these verses from Surah Al-Baqarah, إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار والفلك التي تجري في البحر بما ينفع الناس, to the end of the verse, لآيات لقوم يعقلون. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of day and night, and the great ships with sail with which benefits people, and there are many other things. This is a very long verse actually, so it's truncated here, are signs for people who use reason. So it tells us to look at the sky, look at the earth, look at the alternation of day and night, look at the rain that revives dead land, look at the wind, look at the clouds, look at the wind that blows ships that bring things which are beneficial to people around the world. Look at the complex, interconnected system that you live in that works in perfect harmony and for your benefit. The conclusion of the verse is what? Signs for people who use reason. So the Quran commands us to observe and think and to think or to see the signature of the designer in his design. And then lastly, this argument from our inner moral sense, which the Quran calls the fitrah, or the innate, pure nature that God has created all people upon. So this verse in Surah Ar-Rum tells us that our inner disposition, our original spiritual hardware, if you will, is fundamentally aligned with truth and goodness. And that means that our conscious, our inherent knowledge that some things are right and some things are wrong, it's not a social accident. Have you ever, wondered how, you could have someone who is raised in a family of complete immoral degenerates, and then someone from amongst them is born and just from the time that they're a child completely rejects what they do as a family, won't put up with it. Everybody goes, oh, that is the odd person out. Because there's something in them that drives them to that, right? So our divine compass that's placed within us by our Creator points back to Him. So for us as Muslims, these aren't just abstract proofs, but they're ayat. Notice the Quran, the Quranic vernacular. The word mu'jiza, miracles, never used in the Quran. The word ayah, sign. So every miracle, every creation, every revelation is a sign that points back to our Creator. So all of the signs that Allah gives us appeal to our entire being. They appeal to our intellect, they appeal to our senses, they appeal to our soul. So the Quran doesn't ask us to take a blind leap of faith, but it gives us a comprehensive foundation to have confident, rational, and deeply felt iman, deeply felt faith. Now, the argument that we're building here is not just to defend Islamic belief or Islamic creed. But what we're saying here is that Tawheed is the essential prerequisite for both scientific thought and meaningful moral life. So first, let's go back and think about the concept of the orderly universe that we talked about. The modern scientific method is built on a very important assumption, a very crucial assumption, that the universe is governed by consistent, predictable, and universal laws. So we assume that the same cause will always presume the same effect. But where does that assumption comes from? Well, the assumption, if we were to answer this with what we've studied so far today, is that the principle of Tawheed embeds in us the exception of that assumption. It provides the only solid metaphysical foundation for it. Why? Because we believe that there is a single transcendent and non-contradictory will that governs all of creation. So Tawheed, affirming God's oneness, allows us to understand the universe. It makes the universe knowable and its laws immutable. And so it's this divine consistency that makes science possible. Because the belief of the oneness of God and the worship of God alone and the recognition that He is the only one who can benefit or harm means that we don't give in to superstition. We don't give credence to superstition, sorcery, spirits, and any kind of arbitrary interference from, soothsayers or fortune tellers or anything like that. So he said, but I went to a fortune teller and she told me exactly what I wanted to hear. She told me what I needed to hear. She knew things about me. Strangely enough, fortune tellers can tell you what you need to hear, but don't know if the IRS is auditing them. There's a famous story of a famous fortune teller in Florida where I grew up, Miss Cleo. And she was audited by the IRS and had to shut down because of it. She would do like a phone call, like you would call paid fortune telling line. So the universe is not this chaotic subject. It's not chaotic. It's not subject to the whims of competing forces. There's no pantheon of gods, which is playing with nature. Nature has predictable, immutable, and understandable laws. Even chaos is predictable. Read about chaos theory. Fascinating. Even in what we call chaos, there's predictability. There are laws. There are rules. So the predictable order points directly to a single orderer. But the cosmos is not just a random machine. It's a purposeful system, is the point of our argument here. Every part, from the smallest atom to the largest galaxy, has a function and a goal. So what's the ultimate goal of this grand system? As we said, as Al-Faruqi he says, it's a living theater set in motion by God's command to serve as a stage for man's ethical striving. Many times people will bring up they say, well, if what's happening in the world, where is God? My prayers go out to the people in Central Texas. I don't know if you guys heard about the floods that are happening there right now. There's, I think 24, 25 people that have been lost. Mostly children, right? Teenagers that were camping. The river kind of surged after the floods came through. People will come and they'll say, oh, you believe in God. Where is God from this? The question is, where were you? Where were you if you know this is right for you to go and help? Where were you as an agent of God, of the goodness that you're claiming is absolute? I, as a believer in God, will either give my time or my money, my moral support to make sure that those people are safe, to become a conduit of God's mercy. Because the world is set there as a stage to see who is going to do right and who is going to do wrong. So the nature of our reality is directly connected to our moral purpose. So the world was created for us to act in, to fulfill our roles as trustees. And then lastly, we bring the idea back to human experience. Okay, we believe that we have to be motivated to do something on this created stage, which is the ethical, the living theater for our ethics. Why do I feel that way? Why do I have a sense that I ought to be doing something or that I should do something? It's that innate moral sense. That's an internal subjective proof of an external, objective, transcendent, and normative reality. Our conscience is the internal compass that points to the external source of all value, which is God. So, for Faruqi, the evidence for Tawheed is a three-legged stool. The logical order of the universe makes science possible. The inherent purpose of the universe, which gives life meaning, and the innate moral sense within us, which makes good and right and wrong ethics possible. And all of these point to one unified source. And so next, we'll talk about what are the implications. Now that we've believed in God and we believe that there's a creator and we believe that we've known him through our, rationale, through our feelings, and through our observations in life, what are the implications for that? We'll talk about that in the next section, inshallah ta'ala.